The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1883, and when Florence Everett read the words informing her that her older sister Margaret had died giving birth to her third child, she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She stood on the dusty main street of Walla Walla, Washington, clutching that piece of paper while the autumn wind whipped her dark hair across her face. And she knew without question that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet fathom. Margaret had been her only family since their parents passed from fever 3 years earlier, and now Florence was truly alone in the world except for her brother-in-law Raymond and his children, living 200 miles south in a settlement near the Oregon border. Florence was 22 years old, a schoolteacher in Walla Walla, who had built a quiet life for herself in the growing town where wheat fields stretched golden to the horizon, and the blue mountains rose purple in the distance. She had a small room above the general store, a classroom full of eager students, and enough money saved to feel secure in her independence. But family was family, and those 3 children needed someone now that their mother was gone. The oldest was only 7, and the baby, the one who had cost Margaret her life, would need a woman's care desperately. She made arrangements within the week, said goodbye to her students and the shopkeeper who had rented her the room, and boarded the southbound stage with her trunk and her teaching books and a heavy heart. The journey took 3 days over rough roads that wound through pine forests and alongside rushing rivers, still cold from mountain snowmelt. The other passengers were miners and merchants, rough men who tipped their hats respectfully but kept their distance from the young woman in mourning black. The settlement where Margaret had lived was called Pinewood, though it barely deserved the name of town. It consisted of a trading post, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and perhaps 20 scattered homesteads carved out of the dense forest that covered the hillsides. Raymond's property was 5 miles from the trading post, up a winding track that the stage driver pointed out before leaving Florence standing in the road with her trunk at her feet and dust settling around her shoes. She hired a man with a wagon to take her the final distance, and as they climbed higher into the hills, Florence felt unease growing in her chest like a living thing. Margaret's letters over the years had been cheerful enough, full of news about the children and the farm, but there had been something in the spaces between the words that Florence had never quite been able to interpret. Some quality of loneliness, perhaps, or resignation. Raymond's house was a rough-hewn log structure with a sagging porch and chickens scratching in the dirt yard. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the stone chimney. The children were nowhere to be seen, though Florence could hear a baby crying inside. She paid the wagon driver and stood looking at the house for a long moment, before gathering her courage and knocking on the weathered door. Raymond opened it himself. He was a big man, 40 years old to Margaret's 28, with thick shoulders and large hands, and a face that might have been handsome if not for the hardness in his pale blue eyes. He looked Florence up and down slowly, and something in that gaze made her skin crawl. "Florence," he said, his voice rough as gravel, "got your telegram saying you were coming. Good of you to make the trip." He did not move aside to let her in, just stood blocking the doorway while the baby's cries grew more insistent inside. "I came to help with the children," Florence said, lifting her chin. "They need family right now." Raymond's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. "They do at that. Margaret's gone, and I cannot manage 3 little ones and the farm both. You will be a help, I am sure." Finally he stepped back, and Florence entered the dim interior of her sister's house. The next weeks passed in a blur of cooking and cleaning and caring for the children. The oldest was Emily, a somber 7-year-old with Margaret's brown eyes. The middle child was Thomas, 5 years old and wild as a March hare, always running off into the woods despite Florence's warnings. And the baby, little Margaret named for her mother, was a fussy infant who cried more than she slept and refused to take milk from the goat without a fight. Florence threw herself into the work gratefully, because when she was busy with the children and the endless household tasks, she did not have to think about the way Raymond watched her. He was always there, lurking at the edges of her vision, his eyes following her movements as she hung laundry or swept the porch or rocked the baby to sleep. He did not touch her, not at first, but the weight of his attention was a constant pressure that made her feel like she could not draw a full breath. It was 6 weeks after her arrival, on a cold October evening when the children were finally asleep, and Florence was washing dishes at the basin, that Raymond came up behind her and put his hands on her waist. Florence froze, her hands in the soapy water, every muscle in her body going rigid. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You look so much like her," Raymond said, his breath hot against her neck. His fingers tightened on her waist, pulling her back against him. "Same dark hair, same figure. Could be you were twins instead of just sisters." "Let go of me." Florence tried to twist away, but his grip was iron. Water dripped from her hands onto the floor. "Now, why would I do that?" Raymond's voice dropped lower, intimate and terrible. "You are living in my house, eating my food, sleeping under my roof. Seems only fair you should fulfill a wife's duties, seeing as how I do not have a wife anymore." The words struck Florence like a physical blow. She wrenched herself free with a strength born of desperation and spun to face him, backing up until she hit the wall. "I am your sister-in-law. Your wife just died. Have you no decency?" Raymond took a step toward her, his expression darkening. "Decency does not keep a man warm at night. Decency does not help run a household or raise children. You are here now, and you are family, and that means you belong to me just like everything else on this property." "I belong to no one," Florence said, but her voice shook. She could see in his eyes that he meant exactly what he said, that he had convinced himself of some twisted logic that made her his property to claim. For that night, he let her go. She barricaded herself in the small room she shared with baby Margaret and did not sleep, listening for his footsteps in the hall. But the next day and the days that followed, Raymond's attentions only grew more insistent. He found reasons to touch her, his hand on the small of her back, his fingers brushing hers as she handed him his coffee. He made comments about how well she fit into Margaret's dresses, how natural she looked caring for his children, how it was like his wife had never left at all except now Florence was younger and prettier. Florence began making plans to leave, but the nearest town was miles away, and winter was coming fast to the mountains. She had no horse, no wagon, and 3 children who depended on her. Emily had started smiling again, and little Thomas called her mama sometimes by accident, and the baby had finally stopped crying so much and was starting to grow plump and healthy. How could she abandon them to their father's neglect? On a gray November morning, Florence was in the barn gathering eggs when Raymond cornered her in the dim space that smelled of hay and animals. He blocked the door with his body, and this time there was no pretense of gentleness in his approach. "I have been patient," he said, advancing on her. "More patient than most men would be, but my patience is running thin, Florence. You will be my wife in truth whether we stand before a preacher or not. You are mine." "I am not," Florence said desperately, backing between the stalls. The chickens clucked and scattered. "I will leave. I will go back to Walla Walla." "You will not," Raymond said flatly. "You will stay here where you belong, and you will do as I say, or those children will suffer for your stubbornness. Emily is old enough to take on more work. Thomas could use some discipline, and babies are fragile things. The threat hung in the air between them, clear as day. Florence felt sick. She was trapped, truly trapped, with no way out and no one to help her. Raymond reached for her, his big hands catching her arms, and Florence struggled, but he was so much stronger, forcing her back against the rough wood of the stall. Then the barn door opened, flooding the space with gray daylight, and a voice said, "I think the lady said no." Raymond spun around, and Florence gasped in a breath of air, looking past him to see a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn canvas pants and a sheepskin coat, with a dark hat pulled low over his eyes. A horse stood behind him, a rangy bay with mud on its legs. "This is private property," Raymond growled. "Get off my land." The stranger took a step into the barn, and Florence could see his face better now. He was young, perhaps 26 or 27, with a strong jaw darkened by several days of beard and steady gray eyes that took in the scene before him with obvious understanding. "I was riding past and heard what sounded like someone in distress," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Seems I was not mistaken." "This is family business," Raymond said, but he had released Florence's arms and was turning fully to face this intruder. "My sister-in-law and I were just having a discussion. That did not look like any discussion I have ever seen." The stranger's eyes flicked to Florence, and she saw something in them, concern and anger on her behalf. "Madam, are you all right?" Florence opened her mouth, but no words came. She was shaking, she realized, her whole body trembling with fear and shock and relief at this unexpected interruption. The stranger took another step forward. "I think the lady should come with me." "You think wrong," Raymond snarled, and suddenly there was a knife in his hand, a hunting blade that caught the weak light. "She is staying right here." Everything happened very fast after that. The stranger moved with a speed that shocked Florence, closing the distance between himself and Raymond in 2 long strides. His hand shot out and caught Raymond's wrist, twisting hard, and the knife clattered to the barn floor. Raymond threw a punch with his other hand, but the stranger ducked under it and drove his shoulder into Raymond's midsection, sending both men crashing into the stall door. They grappled in the hay and dust, Raymond's greater bulk against the stranger's speed and skill. Florence pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering, watching the violence unfold. The stranger got an arm around Raymond's neck from behind and squeezed, his muscles straining with effort, until Raymond's face turned red and then purple and his struggles weakened. Finally he slumped, unconscious, and the stranger lowered him to the ground and stood up breathing hard. He turned to Florence and held out his hand. "We need to go, now, before he wakes up." Florence stared at that outstretched hand for only a moment before she took it. His grip was strong and warm, and he pulled her toward the door with quick efficiency. "The children," she said urgently. "I cannot leave the children." The stranger paused, looking at her intently. "His children, my sister's children. She died. I came to help with them, and he—" Florence's voice broke. Understanding crossed the stranger's face. He nodded once, decisively. "Then we get the children. Quick now." They ran from the barn to the house, the stranger keeping himself between Florence and the barn as if Raymond might appear at any moment. Inside, Emily and Thomas were playing with wooden blocks on the floor while the baby slept in her cradle. The children looked up in surprise at the unfamiliar man. "Emily, Thomas, get your coats," Florence said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "We are going on a trip." "Where?" Emily asked, her eyes wide. "Away from here. Quickly, darling, please." The stranger was already gathering blankets and wrapping the baby with practiced efficiency, as if he had handled infants before. He caught Florence's questioning look and said, "I have nieces." Come on, we can take my horse and the wagon if there is one. Raymond had a small wagon in the yard. The stranger hitched his bay to it while Florence helped the older children climb into the back and settled the baby in her arms. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She kept looking back at the barn, expecting Raymond to come charging out at any moment. But they pulled away from that house, down the winding track toward the main road, and no one stopped them. The gray November sky hung low overhead, threatening snow. The children huddled together in the back of the wagon, confused but quiet. Florence held the baby and tried to breathe. After a mile, the stranger spoke. "Name is Boone Mitchell," he said, not taking his eyes off the road. "I have been working a timber claim up the mountain. Was heading into Pinewood for supplies when I heard you." "Florence Everett," she managed. "These are my nieces and nephew, Emily, Thomas, and baby Margaret." Boone glanced at her, and his expression softened slightly. "You came to help with them after your sister passed." "Yes." Florence felt tears stinging her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "I did not know he would be like that. Margaret never said." "Men like that are good at hiding what they are," Boone said quietly. "Until they do not have to hide it anymore." They drove in silence for a while. The road wound down through the forest, pine trees rising tall on either side, their branches heavy and dark. The wagon wheels creaked and the horses' hooves made a steady rhythm against the packed earth. Florence's mind was spinning. What had she done? She had taken Raymond's children. He would come after them. He would say she kidnapped them. Who would believe her story over his? As if reading her thoughts, Boone said, "There is a sheriff in Pinewood. Good man, fair. We will go to him first, tell him what happened. Get it on record." "Will he believe me?" Florence asked, her voice small. Boone looked at her again, and his gray eyes were steady and sure. "I will make sure he does." The trading post in Pinewood had a small office attached where the sheriff worked when he was in the area. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s named Dawson, who listened to Florence's story with growing anger tightening his features. Boone stood beside her the whole time, occasionally adding details about what he had witnessed in the barn. The children sat quietly on a bench, Emily holding the baby while Thomas leaned against her. "Raymond Morrison," Sheriff Dawson said when Florence finished, shaking his head. "Known him for years. Always thought there was something off about him, but his wife never complained." He looked at Florence. "Your sister never said anything." "She wrote cheerful letters," Florence said softly, "but I always felt like there was something she was not telling me." The sheriff sighed heavily. "Well, what you are describing is clear enough. Threatening you, threatening the children. That is not legal guardianship, that is something else entirely. I will ride out to his place and have a talk with him. Make it clear he is to leave you alone." He looked at Boone. "You willing to testify to what you saw if it comes to that?" "I am," Boone said without hesitation. "Good." Sheriff Dawson turned back to Florence. "Where will you go, Miss Everett?" Florence had not thought that far ahead. She had no home anymore, no job, no money beyond the small amount she had saved before coming south. And now she had 3 children to care for. The enormity of her situation crashed over her like a wave. "I do not know," she whispered. "She can stay at my claim," Boone said. Everyone looked at him in surprise. Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I could not impose. It is not an imposition." Boone's tone was matter of fact. "I have a cabin. It is small, but there is room enough. You need somewhere safe to stay while this gets sorted out, and it is far enough from Raymond's place that he would not think to look there." "Young man, are you sure about this?" the sheriff asked, eyebrows raised. "That is a lot of responsibility you would be taking on." "I am sure," Boone said, and something in his voice made it clear he would not be argued with. So Florence and the children went up the mountain with Boone Mitchell to his timber claim. The cabin was indeed small, just one large room with a sleeping loft above. But it was sturdy and tight against the weather with a good stone fireplace and real glass in the windows. Boone gave Florence and the girls the loft and made a pallet for Thomas near the fire, while he said he would sleep in the lean-to where he kept his tools and equipment. "You do not have to sleep in the cold," Florence protested. "I have slept in worse places," Boone assured her. "You and the children need your privacy. Do not worry about me." That first night in the cabin, Florence lay awake in the darkness listening to the children's breathing and trying to understand what had happened to her life. A week ago she had been trapped in Raymond's house, living in fear, seeing no way out. Now she was in the home of a stranger who had appeared like something out of a story to rescue her. It felt unreal, like she might wake up at any moment to find herself back in that barn with Raymond's hands on her. But morning came, gray and cold with the first snow beginning to fall, and she was still in Boone's cabin. She climbed down from the loft carefully so as not to wake the children and found Boone already up, building the fire and putting coffee on to boil. "Morning," he said quietly, looking up at her. "Snow came early this year." Florence wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and came to stand by the fire. Outside the window, white flakes drifted down through the pine trees. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is," Boone agreed. He poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed, and Florence felt a jolt of something she could not name pass between them. She looked up and found Boone watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you did yesterday, for giving us a place to stay. I do not know how I can ever repay you." "You do not owe me anything," Boone said. "What I did, any decent man would have done." "I do not think that is true," Florence said, thinking of all the people in Pinewood who must have known Raymond, who must have seen Margaret growing thinner and sadder over the years and never asked why. Boone was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. "My sister was married to a man who hurt her," he said finally. "By the time our family realized what was happening, it was almost too late. We got her out, but it was a near thing. So when I heard you in that barn, I knew exactly what was happening, and I knew I would not walk away." Florence felt tears burning in her eyes again. "I am sorry about your sister. Is she all right now?" "She is. She is living in Seattle with our mother, working as a seamstress. Happy." Boone smiled slightly. "She has a fellow courting her now, a clerk at a shipping company. Good man who treats her right." The baby started crying upstairs, and Florence set down her coffee to go tend to her. The day unfolded into routine, caring for the children and preparing meals and trying to make the small cabin comfortable for 5 people instead of 1. Boone spent most of the day outside, cutting timber and working on his claim, but he came in regularly to bring more wood for the fire or check if Florence needed anything. It was awkward at first, this strange new living arrangement. Florence was acutely aware that she was an unmarried woman living in a bachelor's cabin, even with the children as chaperones. People would talk if they knew. Her reputation could be ruined. But what choice did she have? She could not go back to Raymond, and she could not afford to rent a room in town, not with 3 children. The days passed, and the snow kept falling, coating the mountain in white. Florence settled into a rhythm with the children. Emily started to smile more often, the tension leaving her small shoulders. Thomas ran wild through the snow like a young wolf cub, building forts and throwing snowballs. The baby grew plumper and more content. And Florence found herself watching Boone whenever he came inside, noticing things about him. The way he was gentle with the children, letting Thomas help him stack firewood and showing Emily how to whittle with a penknife. The way he moved, economical and sure, wasting no motion. The sound of his voice when he read aloud from the newspaper he had brought back from town, deep and pleasant. She was falling in love with him. Florence realized one evening as she watched him teaching Thomas how to tie a proper knot. The realization struck her like lightning, sudden and illuminating. Here was a man who had stepped between her and danger without hesitation, who had taken her and 3 children into his home without asking for anything in return, who was kind and strong and decent in ways she had not known men could be. But what could she do about it? She was a woman fleeing her brother-in-law's unwanted advances, living on Boone's charity with 3 children in tow. She had nothing to offer him, only burdens and complications, and he had never indicated that his feelings toward her were anything more than compassion for someone in trouble. Winter deepened in the mountains. Sheriff Dawson sent word through a rider that he had confronted Raymond, and made it clear that any attempt to contact Florence or the children would result in serious legal consequences. Raymond had been furious, threatening lawsuits and claiming Florence had no right to take his children, but the sheriff had stood firm. The children were staying with their aunt, and if Raymond wanted to contest that, he could take it before a judge. The news should have brought Florence relief, but instead she felt only unease. She knew Raymond. He would not let this go. He was a man who believed he owned what was his, and in his twisted mind that included her and the children. Her fears proved justified on a bitter night in December when Raymond came to the cabin. Florence woke to the sound of breaking glass and Boone shouting. She scrambled down from the loft, her heart in her throat, to find the window shattered and Raymond's face visible through the jagged opening. "Florence," he roared, "you get out here right now and bring my children." Boone was already at the door, rifle in hand. "You are not welcome here, Morrison. Get off this property." "Those are my children," Raymond snarled. "She stole them from me, turned them against me. She owes me." "She owes you nothing," Boone said coldly. "Leave now or I will shoot you for trespassing." Raymond's face twisted with rage. "You think you can keep what is mine? I will burn this place to the ground." Florence saw him raise his arm and realized he had a torch, flames guttering in the wind. Horror flooded through her. The children were still upstairs. The cabin was wood and dry timber and would go up like kindling. Boone saw it too. He fired the rifle, not at Raymond but at the ground near his feet, and the blast was deafening in the cold night air. Raymond jumped back, dropping the torch in the snow where it hissed and died. "The next shot will not miss," Boone said, working the rifle's action to chamber another round. "Leave now." For a moment Florence thought Raymond would charge the cabin anyway, consequences be damned. But then they heard horses coming up the track, and Sheriff Dawson appeared out of the darkness with 2 deputies. "Raymond Morrison, you are under arrest," the sheriff called out. "Drop any weapons and put your hands up." What followed was a confusion of shouting and struggling, as the deputies wrestled Raymond into custody. He fought like a wild animal, screaming obscenities and threats, but eventually they got him onto a horse and bound his hands. Sheriff Dawson came to the broken window and looked in at Boone and Florence. "I had a feeling he might try something," the sheriff said grimly. "Been watching his place, followed him here." He looked at the broken glass and the dead torch in the snow. "This is attempted arson, assault, criminal trespass. He will be going away for a good long while, Miss Everett. You do not have to worry about him anymore." Florence felt her knees go weak with relief. Boone steadied her with a hand on her arm. "Thank you, Sheriff," she managed. "Thank Mitchell here," Dawson said. "If he had not been here to hold him off until we arrived, this could have ended very differently." After the sheriff and his prisoners left, Boone boarded up the broken window and added more wood to the fire. The children had slept through the whole thing, exhausted from a day of playing in the snow. Florence stood shaking by the hearth, the reality of what had almost happened washing over her. "Hey," Boone said softly, coming to stand before her. "You are safe now. He is gone." "He almost killed us," Florence whispered. "He almost burned us alive, the children, everything. But he did not." Boone reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he drew her into his arms. "You are safe, I promise." Florence collapsed against him, pressing her face into his chest and finally letting herself cry. She wept for Margaret, for the children, for the terror of the past months, for everything she had lost and everything she had almost lost again. And Boone held her through it all, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring quiet reassurances. When the storm of tears finally subsided, Florence pulled back slightly and looked up at him. His gray eyes were soft with concern and something else, something that made her heart stutter in her chest. "I am sorry," she said, her voice rough. "For what?" Boone asked. "For bringing all this trouble to your door, for imposing on you, for crying all over you." "Florence." Boone said her name like it meant something. "You have not imposed on me. Having you here, having the children here, it has been the best thing to happen to me in longer than I can remember." He hesitated, then continued, "This cabin has been lonely. I have been lonely. And then you came into my life and suddenly everything is different. Better." Florence's breath caught. "Boone, I cannot ask you to take on a ready-made family, 3 children and a woman with nothing to her name. You are not asking, I am offering." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away the last traces of tears. "I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. I am in love with you, Florence Everett. I think I have been since the moment I saw you in that barn, fighting back against a man twice your size." Joy exploded in Florence's chest like a sunrise. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, trying to be practical, but I cannot help it. You are the best man I have ever known." Boone smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face, and bent to kiss her. His lips were warm and gentle, asking rather than demanding, and Florence kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside. It felt like coming home, like finding a safe harbor after a terrible storm. They were married in the spring of 1884, once the snow melted and the first wildflowers began appearing on the mountainside. The ceremony was held in the small church in Pinewood with Sheriff Dawson as a witness, and the 3 children watching solemnly from the front pew. Emily held baby Margaret, who was walking now and getting into everything, while Thomas fidgeted with his collar and tried not to smile too broadly. Florence wore a dress of pale blue that she had sewn herself from fabric Boone bought in town. Boone wore a new suit and looked so handsome that Florence felt tears prick her eyes when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. The preacher read the familiar words about love and honor and cherishing, and when Boone slipped the simple gold band onto Florence's finger, she knew she was finally, truly safe. They expanded the cabin that summer, adding a second room for the children and enlarging the loft into a proper bedroom. Boone's timber claim was doing well, and he hired on 2 workers to help with the cutting and hauling. Florence started teaching the children their letters and numbers at the kitchen table, using the books she had brought from Walla Walla. Emily proved to have a quick mind and a love of reading. Thomas was more interested in being outside, helping Boone with the work, but he applied himself to his studies when Florence insisted. The news came in July that Raymond had been sentenced to 5 years hard labor for arson and assault. Florence felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not realized she was still carrying. He was gone, truly gone, and by the time he got out, the children would be nearly grown and she would be established as their legal guardian. Life on the mountain settled into a peaceful rhythm. Florence had never imagined she could be so happy, so content. She loved waking up next to Boone in the early mornings, loved the way he kissed her goodbye before heading out to work, loved coming together at the dinner table each evening with the children chattering about their day. This was family, real family, built on love and choice rather than obligation. In the autumn of 1884, Florence realized she was pregnant. She told Boone one evening after the children were asleep, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. The look of wonder that crossed his face was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "A baby," he breathed. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Florence asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Boone said, pulling her close. "You have given me everything, Florence. A family, a purpose, a reason to build something lasting." Their son was born in May of 1885, a lusty, healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him William, and the three older children fell in love with him immediately. Emily helped Florence care for him with a maturity beyond her years. Thomas was fascinated by his tiny fingers and toes. Even little Margaret, who was 2 now and fiercely independent, would sit quietly when Florence let her hold the baby. The years flowed past like the river that ran through the valley below their mountain. Emily grew tall and thoughtful, with dreams of becoming a teacher like her aunt. Thomas became his father's shadow, learning the timber trade and growing strong from the hard work. Margaret remained wild and joyful, always the first to laugh and the last to come inside when called. William grew into a serious, careful child who loved books and building things with scraps of wood. In 1887, Florence gave birth to a daughter they named Caroline. The cabin was bursting at the seams by then, so Boone built a proper house on the property, a 2-story structure with 4 bedrooms and a wide porch that looked out over the valley. Florence cried when she saw it finished, this beautiful home that Boone had built for their growing family. Raymond was released from prison in 1889, but he never came near them again. Sheriff Dawson sent word that he had left Oregon entirely, heading east to start over somewhere else. Florence felt nothing but relief. That chapter of her life was closed. Emily left home in 1890 to attend normal school in Portland, determined to fulfill her dream of teaching. Florence and Boone drove her to the train station in Walla Walla, and Florence held her niece, who had become her daughter in every way that mattered, and told her how proud Margaret would have been of her. "Mama would be proud of you too," Emily said, and it took Florence a moment to realize Emily was talking about her, not Margaret. "You saved us, Aunt Florence. You gave us a real family." Thomas followed Boone into the timber business and proved to have a natural head for it. By the time he was 18, he was managing crews and negotiating contracts. Young Margaret grew into a beauty with a wild spirit that reminded Florence of the untamed mountain where they lived. She married at 19 to a rancher's son and moved to eastern Washington, where she promptly started filling her own house with children. William and Caroline grew up in the new house with all the stability and love that Florence and Boone could provide. William became an engineer, fascinated by the new technologies that were changing the world at the turn of the century. Caroline became a nurse, driven by a desire to help others. Florence and Boone grew old together on their mountain. The timber business prospered, and they were able to build a good life, but the real wealth was in the family they had created together. Grandchildren came, and then great-grandchildren, filling the house with noise and laughter during holidays. On a warm summer evening in 1920, Florence sat on the porch of the house Boone had built, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple. She was 60 years old now, her dark hair streaked with silver, but she felt young when Boone came out to join her and took her hand in his. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice still deep and warm though his face was weathered with age. "That day you came into the barn," Florence said softly. "How you stepped between me and Raymond and said no, how you changed everything." Boone squeezed her hand. "Best decision I ever made." "You ever regret it?" Florence asked. Taking on a woman and 3 children, all that responsibility, Boone looked at her, and his gray eyes were as steady and sure as they had been that day 37 years ago. "Not for a single second," he said. "You are my heart, Florence. You and our family. Everything good in my life started the moment I met you." Florence leaned her head on his shoulder and looked out at the land they had built a life on. Emily was visiting with her 3 children, staying in her old room. Thomas lived just down the mountain with his wife and their 4 kids. Margaret wrote letters every week from her ranch, full of stories about her 6 wild sons. William and Caroline both lived in cities now, but came home for every holiday. And it had all started with a moment of courage, a stranger stepping between her and danger, a cowboy who looked at a frightened woman in a barn and decided to do the right thing. "I love you, Boone Mitchell," Florence said quietly. "I love you too, Florence Mitchell," Boone replied and kissed the top of her head. They sat together on the porch as the sun sank below the horizon, and the first stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear Emily's children laughing, the sound of dishes being washed, the warm sounds of family. The mountain was dark and peaceful around them, the pine trees whispering in the evening breeze. Florence thought about Margaret, her sister who had died so young, and hoped that somehow Margaret knew her children had been loved and raised well, that they had grown into good people who were happy. She thought about that desperate woman who had stood in a barn, trapped and terrified, and marveled at how far she had come. Life had not always been easy. There had been hard winters and lean times, sickness and worry and all the struggles that came with raising a family and building a business from nothing. But through it all, there had been love. Boone's love, steady and constant as the mountain itself. The children's love, given freely and without reservation, the love of a family that chose each other. "Come inside," Florence said finally, standing and tugging Boone to his feet. "Emily made pie." Boone grinned and let her lead him into their house, into the warm light and laughter waiting inside. And as Florence stepped over the threshold with her husband's hand in hers, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with, living the life she had fought so hard to claim as her own. The door closed behind them, shutting out the darkness, and inside the Mitchell house, the family gathered around the table together, passing pie and telling stories and making memories that would last generations. Florence looked around at the faces of the people she loved and felt gratitude swell in her chest so powerfully, it was almost painful. This was what happiness looked like. This was what it meant to be safe, to be loved, to be home. And it had all begun with a cowboy who stepped between her and danger and said no, who saw her not as property to be claimed, but as a person worth protecting, worth loving, worth building a life with. As the evening wore on and the children eventually were sent to bed and the adults lingered over coffee, Florence caught Boone's eye across the table. He smiled at her, that private smile that was just for her, and she smiled back. 37 years of marriage, and she still felt her heart flutter when he looked at her that way. Later, as they lay in their bed with the window open to let in the cool night air, Boone pulled Florence close, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Boone asked sleepily. for stepping between me and Raymond all those years ago, for bringing me here, for giving me this life." Boone's arms tightened around her. "You gave me this life, Florence. You are the one who had the courage to leave, to protect those children, to keep going even when everything was terrible. I just gave you a safe place to land." "You gave me everything," Florence said. "You gave me a home and a family and a love I did not think existed. You showed me what a good man looks like." They lay quiet together, warm under the quilts Florence had sewn over the years. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, and somewhere down the mountain a coyote howled. The familiar sounds of their mountain, their home. "I would do it all again," Boone said finally. "Every moment, every choice. It all led me to you." Florence closed her eyes, contentment washing over her like a benediction. This was her life, hard-won and deeply cherished. These were her people, her family, her love. And tomorrow, she would wake up next to this man who had saved her and loved her and built a world with her. And it would be another day of the beautiful, ordinary life they had created together. As Florence drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man she loved, in the house he had built for her, on the mountain where they had raised their family, she knew that she was the luckiest woman alive. Because 37 years ago, when she had needed someone most desperately, a cowboy named Boone Mitchell had stepped between her and danger and said no. And in doing so, he had given her everything. The story of Florence Everett and Boone Mitchell was one that their children and grandchildren would tell for generations to come. It was a story of courage and love, of standing up to evil and choosing good, of building something beautiful out of desperate circumstances. It was a story of the Wild West, where life was hard and justice was rough, but love could still bloom in the most unlikely places. And it was a story with a happy ending, the best kind of ending there is. Two people who found each other when they needed each other most, who built a life together that honored both the past and the future, who loved each other faithfully through all the years of their long lives. On that mountain in Washington, in the house Boone built and the land they claimed as their own, the Mitchell family grew and thrived and became a testament to the power of doing the right thing at the right moment. Because one man had the courage to step between a woman and danger and say no, and two people had the courage to fall in love and build a family and create something lasting. That is the story. That is how it happened. And that is how Florence Everett found her happy ending in the arms of Boone Mitchell, the cowboy who saved her and loved her and gave her the world.